Okay, let's continue now. Pick up where we left off by starting a discussion on the first of the three major topics that I mentioned, namely database administration. So let me move over to the next slide over here. So database administration, as I mentioned, is a technical managerial function that spans the lifespan of the database. But as you saw in a previous tutorial on this topic, that the operational lifetime of the database is much longer than the design and implementation. So the database administration really spans, the majority of its activities occurs during the operational phase of the database. Now, you can see over here that there's a slight distinction being made between data administration and database administration. Okay, so it might at first glance it might seem like you're splitting hairs, but there is a conceptual difference between the two. Data administration has to do more with the with managing and administering the content that goes into the database. So if you set aside the software, hardware, networking, all the technology that goes into managing the content, at the heart of it all, if you think about a business, it's really the end users really couldn't care less about what kind of hardware you have, what kind of software you have. Their interest is in the content. Okay, and administering that content also has a lot of technical issues to it. For instance, how should that content be organized? If you think of a company like Home Depot or Walmart, and its database will have information on products, on customers, on regulators, all kinds of information that the business would need to maintain. So how should it be organized? Who should have access to what? Who owns what in the organization? If you think of a multinational organization, there is ownership of data also. Who owns what? Who's responsible for what content? So if you leave aside the hardware, software, and telecommunications, you're still left with the content of a database, and data administration refers to the administration of that content. Okay, so you can see, for instance, privacy and security issues, policies, they have to do with the content. Who has access to what content is not a hardware issue, it's not a software issue, it's a business issue. So a university gets to decide, for example, what access a faculty member, what kind of data a faculty member should get to see. The university decides what kind of data a student gets to see, or what kind of data an administrator gets to see. So that's not a hardware or software issue, that's a data issue and an issue of data administration. So we are making a slight distinction here between the content, and then database administration includes the hardware and software. Okay, so what kind of hardware do you need? When do you need to upgrade the hardware? What kind of software do you need? How would you handle software upgrades to your so all the software applications that run on the database. So there's a whole ecosystem of hardware, software, and networks, telecommunication networks, that surrounds this content, that makes it accessible to end users and that makes it usable to end users. Okay, so the administration of that technology is referred to as database administration. So it might seem like a small difference between the two, but there really is a conceptual difference. Okay, so so we make that distinction between those two. And then there is this individual, the database administrator. This is usually a very highly paid function within the information technology function of an organization. It requires a lot of experience. This is not an entry-level position, and typically people get into these database administrator functions after a lot of years of experience in any decent size organization. I suppose in a very small organization, let's say 3-4 person organization, you might have a DBA who's a jack of all trades, who's also writing the application program, who's also administering the database. But typically for any medium to large size business, this DBA function is a separate function, and it requires somebody with a whole lot of experience. And just for out of curiosity, you might want to do a Google search on job descriptions for database administrators and see for yourself what kind of experience is required or is demanded by industry for somebody filling the database administrator position. So this is the individual who's carrying out the functions. These are the two types of functions that fall within database administration. So now, moving on, we are getting a little more detailed view of the database administration. So remember, this is the part of the function that involves not just the content but also the technology, the hardware, software, and telecommunications that go on, the technical ecosystem within which a database operates. Here are some of the things, some of the activities that a database administrator has to do. Okay, so let me. Some of these terms may not be familiar to you, may not make much sense to you, but let me try and explain them in brief. So I'll start with the second one, giving different users access privileges. This is something that all end users can appreciate and are related to. You go to access a particular part of the company's information and it tells you don't have rights to access this data. So a database administrator will make sure that all the technical pieces are in place so that people have access to the information that they need and don't have access to the information that they're not supposed to have access to. Okay, so for instance, there could be if you think of at a very nitty-gritty level, here's a relation with 100, let's say 100 columns. The database administrator might decide that a particular user only has access to the first 10 columns. Another user has access to only the certain other columns in the relation. So the access control can get down to a very nitty-gritty level. So in order to enforce these access privileges and assign them, I hope you see that this is a combination of data administration as well as database administration, meaning that there should be policies in place that determine which type of users get access to what kind of content. And then the technology has to be in place, the technology through the database management system there are various technologies available to us to enforce those access privileges. Okay, but that's again managing that, making sure that that's designed and implemented well falls under the purview of the database administrator. Okay, so setting up indexes to improve database performance. I think you saw in the previous slide or the one before that indexes are used to improve access to the database. I'll give you a simple example of an index. Let's say you are thinking about normalization and you don't quite remember where in the textbook normalization was. So you're trying to find content related to normalization. What you can do is, what we typically do is, we look at the back of the textbook and the indexes are listed alphabetically. So various topics are listed alphabetically. I just go down the list and then look for the word normalization, and it tells me normalization is discussed on page 152, 327 and 425. And all I do is I jump directly to those pages. I don't have to hunt through the book to find the content that I'm looking for. So that's an example of an index. Another example might be you're searching for your reservation in an airline database and you've forgotten your journey's reservation number, your ticket's reservation number, which is a very common thing. Reservation numbers have odd combinations of letters and numerals. But you do remember the date on which you want to travel. You do remember the origin city. You do remember the destination city. So suppose you want to find your ticket based on that information, it would make use of indexes. Otherwise there's a lot of searching that would need to go on in the database. The easiest way to get your ticket would be through your ticket number or your reservation number. But most people don't remember those things. Okay. But to get to that same information through different paths, you have to use indexes. And a database administrator has to make sure that those indexes are designed and maintained properly in order to be sure that the database is serving the needs of the business and people are not having to wait too long in order to get the information that they need. Okay. Now here, this last bullet that you're seeing, so and more, yes, of course, this is just not an exhaustive list of what the database administration entails. There's a lot of This is just to sort of whet your appetite. You can do your own search and find out if this topic intrigues you more. If this is a career that you want to get into, certainly you can find out more information about what the job of a database administrator entails, or what that function entails. But let me continue with this list over here. So you have something called a system catalog. This is a very important. Think of it as a master dictionary of sort. The system catalog tells you all kinds of things about the database, like what kind of relations might be there in the database, then history of transactions. So there are all kinds of things that are maintained in the system catalog, and different people can have access to different portions of that system catalog. And the database administrator has to make sure that that the system catalog is maintained, is accurate, up to date, and also the proper people are given access to the appropriate segments of it. Okay. Now, this first bullet that you see, give each user a particular view of the database. A view, we'll see what a few slides later, a little more detailed description of what a view is. But let me give you a simple example of what a view is. A view is a subset of the database, is a restricted view of the database. Not everybody needs to see everything in the database, okay? So, for example, as a customer, when I log into the Home Depot's database through its portal, I go to the homedepot.com. As a customer, I don't really need to see all the HR information about its employees. Okay, who are all the names of all the employees in the stores, when were they hired, what their pay grade is, and all. I don't need to see that information. I just need to see information about products, whether they are in stock, and whether and what their price is. Okay, so I need to see a particular subset of the database. That is my view. So I have a particular view of the database. Same thing if you think of the hospital database. It has information on patient treatments, it has information on patients' insurance records, patient demographics, and all those kinds of things. So a doctor would need to see a subset of that database. A hospital billing department needs to see another subset of the database. So every end user is interested in not the entire database, but a particular view. So going back to the airline example, if you think of United Airlines, its database consists of information on aircraft, on passengers, on flight crew, on cabin crew, engines, because they have to maintain their aircraft. So if you think of an aircraft mechanic who works for United, they are in the hangar and they're trying to do a repair work on an aircraft. So they have a very particular view, a very limited view of a very particular view of United's database. All they want to know is about the aircraft. When was it last serviced? When was it bought? Any defects? What was its flight? How many flights did it take? It couldn't care less about who the passengers were on that aircraft. So every end user has a particular view of the database, and the major task of the database administration and of the database administrator, the DBA, is to create those views and to maintain those views. And you will see later on that views also provide information security. Okay. Another major activity that falls under database administration is creating and maintaining user accounts. Okay. As I mentioned early on in the first part of this, the first tutorial on this topic, the one before this one, that any practical database, commercial database, will have hundreds, if not thousands, of users working on it. So every user must have an account, and you can imagine for every account there'll be a username, there'll be a password, and every account must have certain privileges. What kind of data does this person have access to? And what is the role of that person? So again, coming back to the Home Depot example, if I set up an account on Home Depot's database through its portal, then I'm given certain privileges. I can't go in and change the price of an item, for example. Okay, but I can create a shopping cart and then I can order online. Okay, so I have a role as a customer. In my role as a customer, I have certain privileges and I don't have other privileges. So defining the privileges, access privileges, the operational privileges, and the roles of different end users falls under the purview of database administration. Now, this last bullet that you're seeing over here is a fairly technical topic, but again, not too difficult to appreciate what's going on. When you have thousands of users working with the database simultaneously, so your database typically is stored on disk, on secondary storage of some sort, some secondary permanent storage. So all the processing that goes on here is your end user. This goes on in main memory. Okay. Now this could be a collection of hundreds of small computers, or it could be one large computer, doesn't matter, but it goes on in main memory. And all these hundreds of users that you have, each of them has a portion of main memory that's reserved for them to do their query processing and the access and all that. So this temporary space in which information is brought in from the database and processed for all these hundreds of users, that has to be maintained, and it takes quite a lot of effort to do that efficiently, so that you don't use up too much memory, and you basically use your hardware resources efficiently, and also have the end users have a good experience in terms of things being done quickly. They don't have excessive amounts of weight. So again, we're getting a little more deeper and deeper into what database administration entails, and I hope you are gradually beginning to see that all these activities put together paint a picture of a fairly senior level person who has to oversee all of these activities during the operational phase of the database. Okay. Another major, and again this is very relevant to what we have done in the class so far, because we spent a fair amount of time on database design, your entity relationship modeling and your relational database design. So this data dictionary, this maintaining the data dictionary is absolutely important. It's a very important task of the database administrator. So what this data dictionary contains, it's sort of think of it as a master book on the contents of the database. So here are some of the things that so the data dictionary doesn't actually contain the data that's in the database. The data dictionary contains what is called metadata. It's data about the data. So here are some of the things that are in the database. So the names of all the tables, the names of all the columns in each table, the indexes that are on each table, and who can access which table. These are just some examples of what a data dictionary contains. And the way you, meaning the end user, why this data dictionary is so important, it's obviously important to people who maintain the database, but even as an end user, let's say you're looking for a certain information in the database and you're not sure where to go in the database to look for that information. This dictionary is your guide. So you might think of the closest analogy that I can draw is it is like the table of contents in a textbook. So if you want to limit, if you're looking for something in a textbook, then without having to search the entire textbook, the table of contents gives you a high level organized view of the contents of the book. And this is very similar. So just like in the table of content, you see the names of the chapters, all the subsections and sections and subsections in the chapter, that immediately tells you what the nature of the content is in each of those subsections and can guide you in your path through looking through the textbook. So this is similar to that. Think of this as a table of content, but it's a very sophisticated table of content about the database. Okay, so we have spent a little bit of time talking about database administration. Let me stop this recording for now, and we will then in the next recording we'll continue with the second major topic, that was concurrency control.